All right. Good morning. What a privilege it is to meet with you and to share with you what I think is some pretty exciting stuff. To be transparent and fully disclosing, I'll remind you that this is a hospital that has been around for 110 years, has always been a place of faith. It was built on a foundation that God is the healer and we are the gloves on that healing hand. So I don't want to be bashful about that because that's who we are and how we believe. But as Arby said, not only am I an administrator, but I'm a clinician, which means science burned in me long before the spreadsheets and the strategic plans. That's what got me started, the amazing grandeur of life. And so that scientist is still alive and well in my heart. And so I want to talk to you about spirituality and health. What's going on there? And I subtitled it, I couldn't pick which one. Is religion good for you? And what's God got to do with it? I thought they both fit. So I went with that. So this is going to be a 15-minute whirlwind on the spirituality and health. The data that we're going to review spans about 3 decades. People have been interested in this in a long time. Science has been around for a long time. Spirituality and religion have been around for a long time. Where do they intersect? Do they intersect? First, we're going to talk about what spiritual and religious mean to us in contemporary society. Does religious experience or participation result in better life coping or health or both? Is there any science to show and explain these differences? And since I only have 15 minutes with you and I don't know you very well, I figured I'd go big and I'd say, can this science prove the existence of God? So we're not messing around here. All right, this is the only cartoon I have, and it says, sometimes I question if there really is a dog. And these are, of course, the agnostic fleas here. So I get a kick out of that. So what does it mean to be religious? Well, in formal terms, it's relating to or manifesting a faithful devotion to a deity or ultimate reality, usually associated with some kind of a system of doctrines or beliefs, a pious reverence toward God. And spiritual is a little broader definition of that. It includes those who are not only deeply religious, but those who are superficially or connect to the ethereal and existential in some meaningful way. Meditation, yoga, various types. There's a lot of spirituality practices that are popular in society today. So I'm going to go first into how religion influences coping and health. And we're going to talk about some very specific studies, but we're also going to review meta-analysis. For those of you that aren't familiar with the term meta-analysis, it's really the study of studies, where you take a lot of studies, as many as you can find, and then you identify what are the ultimate findings, and where do those agree or disagree. And so that's really what a lot of this is about. So we're going to go shallow and deep many times over. So buckle your seatbelts. First, let's talk about the religious coping that happened something we all experienced, 9/11. What happened is that the researchers dove into that national tragedy to try to understand, okay, we haven't seen something like this since Pearl Harbor. How do people cope? And what they found was that the number one thing that they did to cope was talking with others, trying to make sense of it all, just being part of a community. But the second most important, and 9 out of 10 people went to religion to identify meaning, find comfort, find courage, decipher all this chaos that was going on around them. I wonder why that is. There's a lot of other tactics there, but religion was number 2 at 90%. We heard a presentation just now about the elderly. And the elderly, in this particular study, back in 1988, identified that well-being was highly correlated with religious participation. Now, they called this intrinsic religiosity. That's a funny term, but, researchers do weird things like that. But this is the well-being scale. And what they found was that with church attendance or low religiosity, those people, and there was plenty of them in this study, identified as a lower sense of well-being. And as they went up in quintiles, or the quartiles of religious and church attendance, their sense of well-being went up very substantially and measurably. What about depression and well-being and religion? How do those correlate? Well, religious involvement is related to greater well-being and happiness in There's 326 studies out there on this in the last few decades. Well, actually between 1872 and 2010, so it's over 100 years. People have been studying this stuff. And 79% of those correlated with a religious involvement and a sense of well-being and happiness. Now, I'm going to point out that 3 of those said that religion actually made you less happy. But that's only 1%, so it's pretty small, and when you look at the weight of that evidence, it suggests that religious involvement does produce a happier person in general. There's also correlation at a little less correlation. 61% of 444 studies showed that there was less depression and faster recovery from depression with a religious component to that person's experience in life. Here's one of those studies where it was the probability of non-remission of depression, 845 medical inpatients, and what they identified was that the highly religious individuals were less likely to stay depressed, and that the less religious were more likely to stay depressed. It didn't say that everybody, that religion actually rescued them completely from their depression, but there was a significant measurable statistical correlation between that. And when you see this P and a bunch of zeros, just give it this way. More zeros, the more correlated the data is. This is a p-value of 1/5,000, 10,000, something like that. Anyway, it's a high p-value. Another fascinating study, this is very recent, just 2014, where they actually went in and identified through brain studies the thickness of the cortex. There were some people that said, now is the brain any different in people that are highly religious versus people that it's not very important? Well, fascinating study that showed, and this is in the Journal of American Journal of Psychiatry, so it's not a lowbrow journal by any means. They identified that the thickness of the cortex is higher in people that have religion as very important to their life versus those that aren't. And this is correlated to depression, because if you have a thicker cortex, you're more resilient to depression. Fascinating, isn't it? What about those if other studies that were done by Dr. Held Koenig, a really great health and spirituality researcher? He said even when people are depressed and they stay depressed, they're happier in their depression than the people that aren't religious. Isn't that weird? And you can study this. It's published. But they have a greater purpose in meeting, greater optimism and hope, more gratitude and thankfulness, and they're more generous, even though they're really bummed out. Fascinating study. Suicide, religious involvement, 75% of the studies showed that there was less suicide and a more negative attitude toward suicide for those that were involved in religion. Could it be that this gives people a life meaning that protects them from those kinds of thoughts? How about meaning, purpose, and hope? Religious involvement is related to, in 45 studies, 93% significantly greater meaning and purpose in life and greater hope. Alcohol and drug abuse, huge scourge to our society. Religious involvement in these 278 studies showed that 86% of them had significantly lower rates of alcohol and drug abuse for those involved in religion, especially among the young. And I can attest to that. I was a child that was quite steeped in substance abuse in my teen years, and when I found faith, that was the remedy, the antidote to my desire for mind-altering substances. Forgiveness, altruism, and gratitude are also highly correlated with religious involvement. More forgiveness, volunteerism, and there's only 5 gratitude studies, but 100% of those showed that people that are involved in faith are more grateful in general. Fascinating stuff. And social support as well. Domestic, divorce, single-parent families, there are of 79 studies. I know that we hear that people of faith get divorced as often or even more. Well, this is a meta-analysis, 79 studies, 86% of them showed that there was greater stability and less divorce in people of faith. So what about physical health research? This is mostly the social side of things, but the physical health research is equally fascinating. In the immune and endocrine functions, IL-6 is an immune response chemical that correlates with your immune response. The higher your IL-6, the more your body is likely to be reactive to external stimuli and therefore create inflammatory responses. Inflammatory responses create things like irritation of the inside of your blood vessels, which create things like atherosclerosis. Right, Dr. Nahapetian? I do remember that from my nursing days in A&P. So, and this study shows that people that attend religious services, and it's fascinating, never or almost never, their IL-6 levels were high. The ones that went to church once to twice a year to once to twice a month, it was much lower. So, you know, that Christmas and Easter could be doing you some good. But if you go to church once a week or more, that includes the Wednesday night prayer meetings, my friends, your IL-6 levels are likely to be the very lowest. Fascinating data. What about death from cancer? Now, this is interesting because this is denominational research. On this, the general population has an index of 1, and that's just the way that you create indices like this. But what they found was, through research of these various religious groups, that the Hutterites, which are actually similar to the Amish — I had to go on the internet to find out because I didn't know what a Hutterite was, but it's a kind of a historical 1500s based ancient Christian religion. And the Amish have very much lower death rates from cancer. Seventh-day Adventists, of which I happen to be a member, have looks like about 55% less likelihood of dying from cancer. And the Mormons are even better than the Adventists. So I don't know what they're doing, but they're doing some great stuff. And the Amish, you know, that corn-fed beef, who knows what they're doing over there. But they have the lowest death rates from cancer. Now, this may be lifestyle, but you put this together with all the other research, and things get very interesting. Your blood pressure is likely to be lower if you are involved in religion in some way. This is 3,600 people, 65 and over. So it's more the geriatric population, but fascinating things there. Mortality from heart disease. Also, on this one, higher is better because the survivability from heart disease and religious orthodoxy, people with no faith were, their survival was about 82%. For those with faith, it was about 90%. So there's a pretty significant differential there. Cardiovascular functions, blood pressure, cardiovascular artery disease, all those things. And mortality, religious involvement related to a greater longevity in 82 of 120 studies. And 6% of those, just to be transparent, said that religion actually made you die faster. But it's much smaller. The correlation seems, this is about direction, compass finding, way finding, not nailing it right down. Life expectancy of those who participate in religious activities is also fascinating. This was done in 1999, and 21,000 subjects, so it's not a small sample. And those that, unfortunately, there was a disparity between whites and blacks. Blacks that never attended church were expected to die at about 66. If they were going to church greater than once a week, it went up to in the 80s, into the 80s, and whites were a little bit better off. But same kind of a correlation relative to participation in religion and life expectancy. So let's summarize the science here. Religion is commonly used to cope with stress in general and medical illness in particular. There are psychological and social mechanisms to help explain how it affects our coping, and it's associated with greater well-being, less emotional disorder, and even medical outcomes and longer life. So let me go back to that set of criteria that I said at the beginning. So, does spirituality and religion result in better health? The evidence would say absolutely. There's a strong correlation. Is there science? Science. People are always saying, well, you can't prove God. Well, wait a minute. Is there science to show and explain these differences? The evidence is yes. And the biggest question, did I prove the existence of God? Well, maybe not, but I suggest that within this data, we can see the shadow of God. And there's one of them right there. Thank you very much.